We're there.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Ministry on the Edge on Race Relations and the Role of the Church. My name is Barbara Hamm-Lee, and I am honored to serve as your moderator for this evening's conversation. I'm going to turn it over immediately to Reverend Dr. Sherry Daniels, who will introduce our panel, who will be discussing race and the church this evening. Dr. Daniels?
All right. Good evening, Barbara. Thank you for agreeing to serve as our moderator, and for all of the panelists that have joined us for this conversation, and then for all of the persons that have registered. We welcome you, and I do on behalf of Norfolk United Methodist Church. I serve as the senior pastor there, and I am a lifelong United Methodist and a elder in full connection in the Virginia Conference. And so it was natural and appropriate that I made a request to my district superintendent, M. Wayne Snead, and he is the co-host of this conversation. He is our district superintendent for the Elizabeth River District, but he has a long history of service and a number of firsts in terms of planting new churches and doing effective ministry in the community. But his main role for us right now is the fact that he is the mission strategist for the Elizabeth River District. Along with myself and Wayne, we have M. Garlinda Burton. She is a resource specialist from one of our general agencies, the General Commission on Religion and Race. Garlinda Burton has served the United Methodist Church for many years in various capacities. Some of you will remember and recall that she was the editor of the Interpreters magazine for a number of years. She'll tell you more about that, but she's currently working with G-Corps and agreed to join us for this conversation so that we could hear that perspective and the wealth of knowledge that she has acquired over the years. And then along with Garlinda, we also have Dr. Cedrick Bridgeforth. Dr. Bridgeforth is out of the CalPAC Conference of the United Methodist Church. He is the lead consultant for our Virginia Conference Focus 2020. And many of you are familiar with that initiative, but that initiative was created several years ago to address the issue of strengthening African-American churches. We have evolved because we had to, because the times have changed and the world is spinning and changing all around us. So Dr. Bridgeforth is joining us this evening as well. So Barbara, that is our panelist, and I'm so sorry, I'm remiss. Jason Stanley is also working with us this evening. He's not presenting, but he is serving in a very, very important capacity. He is helping myself to make all of this work because he is monitoring our Q&A and our chat. He's trying to keep me together as the technology so that this is a smooth conversation and done timely, decently, and in order. So Jason is serving in a dual capacity, but he serves for our district, the Elizabeth River District, as the Director of Congregational Development. Jason, I'm not saying it right. What is the correct title? I don't want to go on record as not given the correct title.
Coordinator for Church Revitalization.
Oh Lord, I was so far off. That's a sin and a shame. But he is doing a phenomenal job in and through that ministry platform. So with all of that said, Barbara, let me turn it back to you, and you take us right on into our conversation.
Okay, thank you again, everyone, for participating. I want to invite the audience. We do want to hear from you. We would love to have your questions. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom if you're on Zoom. You will see the questions there. If you're watching us on Facebook Live, you can send us a message through Facebook Live. But if you're on Zoom, please use the Q&A button, type in your question, and I'll be happy to try to get to as many questions as we can. So if a tsunami happened on the other side of the world, some may be aware, unaware, and unaffected. Others may hear the news and be aware of the disaster, but they're still unaffected. Still others may be aware and only inconvenienced by the tsunami because perhaps they were going to travel to that part of the world. But then there are those that are affected by the crisis and those who are deeply impacted. Relatives are lost, homes are lost, friends are lost, income is lost. During the coronavirus pandemic, as an example, we can see how that tsunami affected all of us, the entire world, not just those of us here in the United States. This critical conversation is about race, particularly African Americans and other people of color. It will not be hijacked with the interjections of all lives. What about all lives matter? We know that this is true. All lives do matter. However, the treatment of said lives has not been equal and is very, very different. African Americans have been disproportionately affected by the novel coronavirus pandemic. African Americans have been killed by police in greater numbers simply because of the color of their skin, and particularly based on the ratio of the population compared to the greater population. African Americans are impacted by systemic racism on a daily basis. Your African American Christian brothers and sisters are hurting. And as a very wise man I know says, that which does not affect you does not concern you. But we must all be concerned with what's going on in our country today. The church is supposed to be the moral leader, the headlights instead of the taillights, as my pastor talked about in his sermon this morning. But we cannot preach or minister to others that which we are unable to accept within ourselves. So this conversation is the beginning of many hard, long, painful looks at racism within the United Methodist ranks, within our own ranks, within our own families, within our circles of influence. We need to acknowledge it, repent of it, and ask God to give us the strength to make real and lasting change. So our agenda, we want to let Reverend Snead set the stage for our conversation. Wayne?
John Wesley talked about, how is it with your soul? This is a time when we need to look inside of ourselves and examine our soul. Go into every nook and cranny that we find racism in our lives and in ourselves. To be purged and to be healed and to allow the Holy Spirit to brood over our hearts. It is a time of doing no harm. We need to do good, not do harm. There has been a lot of harm that's been done, and we need to change that. But it's not just a saying. We need action behind doing no harm. And then we are to stay in love with God. And to talk about how are we deepening our affection with God? And how can we love God and how can we love one another in a way that honors and glorifies God instead of perpetuating a system of injustice and inequality on Black persons? That is our task.
That is a daunting task, but we're going to try to tackle it and begin the conversation at least. Jason, can I ask you if you would please look at the Q&A and answer the gentleman? He's having trouble figuring out where we are in the conversation. We're just getting started, but I believe he may be having some issues. If you can see that question, I'd appreciate that. Reverend Daniels, I'm going to turn it over to you because I know that Ms. Burton needs to leave us. She can't stay with us for the entire 2 hours. So I'll turn it back over to you to reintroduce her and give her a chance to speak with us. Unmute your mic.
Again, welcome, Garlinda. Garlinda is currently serving with the General Commission on Religion and Race. She brings a wealth of knowledge and experience in terms of serving the United Methodist Church over a number of years. I'm not going to cite the number of years because that might give someone a clue into Garlinda's age, and that's not politically correct. But let me say this. She has served at least 2 general agencies of our church that I know of. She has served at many levels, and she has a great love and affection for our church. More than that, she has a deep love and affection for our communities. And she knows, as we all do, that when any part of the community is hurt, we all hurt. And so we are welcoming her this evening as we move into this conversation. Barbara, let me say this. I am helping Jason to monitor
okay.
our Q&A and to look at our chat. So if you see me look down or look away, I'm not disinterested. I'm just trying to keep up with the reflections. For the
I got you.
participants that are coming in, some of you may have been in the waiting room just a little longer than you expected, and we were going live. But let me give some context. We prayed together as a panelist before we took the broadcast live, and we are working to make sure that we not have too many glitches and or hiccups. So you were put into the waiting room and you waited a little longer because Zoom is working very hard to ensure that the security of our meeting is maintained and that we don't have any problems with persons who were not invited inviting themselves. So we ask that you be patient with us. And with that said, Garlinda, please, you have the floor. You have the mic.
Good afternoon, everyone. I really want to thank all of you for allowing me to enter into your conversation as we have a national and even international conversation about what we can do to move forward, to press on from conversation about race, which has probably taken place ever since John Wesley came to these shores. We have been talking about race and arguing about race and dodging our responsibility about race. And now it is past time for the United Methodist Church to act. I wanted to give you just a little context. I am a United Methodist deaconess. I am a 5th generation United Methodist on both sides. Both sides of my family go back 5 generations in the former Methodist Church and now United Methodist. And in fact, our family split over the issue of racism in 1939. There were some in the family who were very upset about the creation of the central jurisdiction and the further segregation and marginalization of we good Methodists. And some of my family went on to become Baptists. They said, we're done with the Methodist Church. And I'm in the stream that stayed in the church. And so this tension on race has been in my family, like I said, for many generations. And so that it's very personal to me because I love Jesus Christ as my Savior. I am a Wesley woman. I believe in the teachings of John Wesley, and I have believed the promises of my church and the promises that God has made to do good through our church. And so this is very urgent for me. Sherry was teasing me about my age. My oldest grandson turned 28 yesterday, so I'm feeling it. I am really feeling it. But I'm still on the battlefield. I want to say a couple of things. One is that we have to get clear that when we're talking about racism, we are not talking about people who are rude to each other, who don't speak to people of color. We're not talking about when one person uses a racial slur, although all of those things are expressions of racism. What we are battling in our church and society is institutional racism, which is the institutionalization, the encoding of white supremacy in the very fabric of our church in a way that has marginalized and otherwise affected people of color, African American, Latino, Native American, Asian American, Pacific Islander. In this country, we have to get very clear that even those of us, our white brothers and sisters who would never think of using a racial slur, would never think of keeping someone out of the church, would never think of saying a mean thing to a person of color. That's a wonderful gift that you are working on internalized racism. At the same time, it is the institutionalization of racism that we are fighting. We are fighting the fact that our very cathedrals and colleges and universities and mission agencies are built on soil that was stolen from Native American people, and many of them built by slave labor of African American people. And our wealth has come on the backs of people of color. We have to deal with the fact that we live in a church and a society that has come to this country from other lands, mostly Europe, and said that the Native American languages, which were the official languages of this country, were wiped out in favor of one language, to the point now where people are being attacked and confronted for speaking a language other than English in public. And we teach English only in public schools, and we have teachers who teach English as a second language who cannot speak another language, which is, to me, very problematic. We have in this church an imbalance of wealth, where many of our Black churches and other churches of color are struggling financially, while white churches that were built on the wealth that was gained from slavery, from Native American oppression, from Chinese folks who were working the railroads at coolie wages, where people of color were subjugated in order to benefit white society, and where even our hair texture, our skin color, what our names are, affect us in the place where we can't get bank loans. We're marginalized in applying for jobs. We are the last ones to get health care. I'm doing a piece this week with Navajo folks. The Navajos are dying at an even higher rate than African Americans, and they have received no government money that they were promised for COVID. This is institutional racism, and it shows up in the church in the ways that we are segregated by population into sanctuaries. Most of our churches are racially separate, and most white churches are all white. It shows up in the way we spend our money. We go to general conference, and I sit in those meetings, and the majority of people in the finance committee are white, and most of them are male, and they make decisions on the priorities of the church based on the best interest of white churches and white congregations. And so we have to get very clear that if we're going to fight racism, if we're going to answer the call of God to finish this unfinished agenda, that we can't wrap it in a Jesus bow and talk about just getting along. This is talking about social, moral, political, and spiritual transformation, so that we can stand at the throne, as said in Revelation, from all nations and all tribes, and celebrate and worship the Lamb of God who has brought us to where we are. And so I want us to be very, very clear that while it is important and vital that we deal with the personal ways that racism affects us and how we live out our lives as people of color and white people in the society, we are battling systems. And the systemic challenge in our church is to get real about where racism lives in this church. We are still 92% white in our congregations in a country that is about 40, now 50% people of color, and we do not plant churches among poor communities of color who are crying out for the word of Jesus Christ. So we've got to get really, really clear. And unless we are willing to look utterly in each other's faces, then we are a noisy gong and a clanging cymbal.
So, Garlinda, let me ask you a question. For those of you who don't know, I host a radio show called Another View on NPR in the Hampton Roads area, and we did a show this past Thursday. Dr. Antipas Harris wrote a book called "Is Christianity the White Man's Religion?" And what he was talking about is this desire for young people in particular to find another way to get the spirituality, to get the teachings of Jesus to other than the church. What is the United Methodist Church doing to make sure that we are being inclusive and bringing those young people that are right now out on the streets marching because they see this systemic racism on a daily basis, and they are tired of it? What can the church do? What should the church be doing to bring them into the fold instead of rejecting them?
I am so glad you asked me this question. I refer often to an article that I read a few years ago when Black Lives Matter was just getting started. And a young woman talked about why she felt, and she was a young African-American woman, that the church was irrelevant to the current civil rights movements. And one of the things she said was, number one, that the white church is not interested. And she herself was a Christian. The white church is not interested, and that churches of color often have gone silent. And so I think, first of all, let me say, I do not think that we are beyond being the Church of Jesus Christ. However, we got to be Christians, whether it was missionaries coming for the wrong reasons or the right reasons. I believe that Jesus Christ is the Savior of the world. He's my Savior, and he has come to reign forever and ever in love, justice, and peace. I believe that. At the same time, we, the church now, are not the leaders of this movement. If we want to get young people involved, then we have to go where young people are. We've got to walk out of our sanctuaries, and we've got to join them and listen to them. There was a time when religious leaders were the leaders of the civil rights movements and other movements. But there was also a time when there was always a younger crowd, the Brown movement among the Chicanos, as we said back in the days, the Black Panther movement, which people misunderstand as a violent movement, but they fed more school children breakfast than we feed in our churches. The organization of Asian American folk in California who were fighting against the oppression of Asian Americans, California, those were all led by young people. And so I think we are, one of the reasons that the church has fallen back is because, I don't know about you, but in my churches, the churches that I am around, most of the people are over 50, over 60, and the leadership is over 50, over 60. You know, my mom's 86 years old, and until 2 years ago, she had been United Methodist Women's president when I was a kid, and she was still had rolled back to be president. And I love me some United Methodist women, but we have got to get out with young folk. So if we want young people to come into our churches, we have to show young folk that we are with them. We may have to open our churches to community meetings and partner with them, and not try to be the leaders of this movement, but let those folks help us and partner with us to educate us about what's going on, because many of us, people of color and white folk, have been in church mode so long that we are not aware of all that's going on out in these streets. And United Methodists of all stripes tend to be more middle class, more moneyed than people in the streets, and we're not in touch with the streets.
You know, and I was just going to, that's a perfect segue to my next question to you. So are you surprised at the number of people, particularly those who are church folk, as we call them, who were literally shocked at what is happening in the community now, because they said they really did not know that Black people in particular were facing the issues that they are facing and facing the racism that they face on a daily basis? Were you surprised that they're shocked? And what is it about the church that causes such a disconnect that there could be that kind of shock?
We're doing a series starting tomorrow. We are talking to pastors, a white female pastor, a Korean American pastor, and 2 African American pastors who are going to talk about preaching against racism. And they're presenting their sermons, the sermons are linked there. We have created a church that is so fragile. We have this issue of fragility that we have lost our prophetic edge. We have heard from more pastors, white and people of color, who say, well, how can I preach about this? The people in my church will leave. The people in my church will get upset. So we don't have preachers who are preaching the gospel with a Bible in one hand and a newspaper, that's how old I am, in another hand. We're not preaching from the headlines. We're not making the gospel relevant to what is going on right now. And so, no, I'm not surprised, because we as lay people who are Sunday school teachers and leaders and lay leaders, and as pastors in our conference, we are not bringing the world into the church and saying, we are to bring the gospel to bear on all of these ills in our world. We're not doing that. So no, I wasn't surprised at all.
We have a question from Arthur. He says, if apology and repentance is part of the goal towards moving forward, wouldn't both sides of racism in the United Methodist Church need to acknowledge and agree on the evidence of institutional racism within the United Methodist Church before either side can sincerely apologize and repent? I don't see how any beneficial apology or repentance would be sincere until there is individual confession of fault or guilt of being a proponent of the institutional and systematic racism or systemic racism in the church.
I'm not sure I understand the question. I don't know what he means by both sides. As I said before, there's a difference between people being ugly to each other and being angry with each other about a racialized conflict. But again, I am unyielding on this. If we are talking about institutional racism, we are talking about an institution that has or institutions that have propped up white supremacy. And we don't call it that. We think white supremacy is the KKK. But when you get into a cabinet meeting and bishops and district superintendents say, we can't send this Black pastor to this white church because the white people won't have it, that is institutional racism. And so we've got to get apologies and repentance are only important if they're sincere and move us forward. You know, when Jesus healed folk, he said, go and sin no more. So if I steal from a store one day and ask God to forgive me, and then I steal from the store the next day and ask God to forgive me and keep doing that, I'm not repentant. And so we have to get real clear again about what racism is. And would it help to have truth-telling and repentance? It probably would. But again, I think we have to be very careful that it doesn't become ceremony, that this becomes action. Because we're good at worshiping and we're good at singing kumbaya when we don't really mean it. We've got to put some verbs in our sentences and put our shoulder to the wheel. There is I think it was Georgetown, but I can't remember, a university that gave money back to the Black community because they recognized that their building, their college was built on land that was tilled by slaves and built by slaves. That's putting your money where your mouth is. You know, there have been people who have said, there was a march in Atlanta yesterday from an African-American United Methodist Church to a historically white church, where they came together and did some confession about how the church has been broken in that conference because of race. And they had some real truth telling. That's putting the shoulder to the wheel. They were in the streets. And so it's that kind of tangible thing that we've got to do. If we're not uncomfortable, we're not doing it right.
Okay, I'm also going to bring in Wayne and Sherry into the conversation. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me say a word about that. And Garlinda, thank you. And we are, again, monitoring everything. A number of folk have asked over and over, how many folk do we actually have online? Right now on Zoom, we have over 100 participants now on Zoom, along with the 6 panelists. But we have sent it out to Facebook Live through the Norfolk United Methodist Churches page. And also I have sent it to my YouTube channel live as well. It is being recorded and will be made available on demand for later. But I do want to go back to one of the questions that we asked about systemic racism and how we deal with it in the church. And Garlinda, you alluded to the fact that we are going to have to get out into the streets. We're going to have to allow the community to speak to us, and we're going to have a willingness to hear what they're saying. Mm-hmm. And then acknowledge what we have done in the church over the years. This did not just start happening. Right. This has been happening for years. It's been happening since I've been going to general conferences, since I've been going to annual conferences, since I've been going to what used to be the church, the church board of administration in the local church, the administrative board, excuse me. And so this is not new, and we've been fighting this a long time. But I think you're right. What feels different this time is that we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the young folk we're dealing with, they don't care how long you've been serving in leadership in the local church.
Mm-mm.
And they don't care who you're related to. And so they really do want to know, are you authentic? And are you sincere? Are you on board and in the Word of God? And another question that came in, Wayne, that was for you. I'll give you a minute to think about it. Someone wanted to know anonymously, specifically from you, if Jesus had brown skin. So I'm gonna give you a minute to think about that one. But the other part of that is this. I welcome those young people and the people in our communities to hold us accountable. But if this conversation is to be authentic, those of us who have been in the church, we have to hold them accountable too. So it's hard for you to talk about us. It's hard for you to disagree with us even if you're not willing to come in, sit at the table, and have a heart-to-heart dialogue. And that goes for both sides. And so I think we're going to have to think about that in the future, especially with all of the changes that are going on. Everybody has to be willing to listen, and everybody has to be willing to say, we've been complicit in this.
Let me make sure that we're not being disrespectful of Garlinda's time. It is after 6:30. Can you stay with us, or do you need?
I really need to go. Yeah, I am so sorry. Okay. I would invite everyone to visit our webpage at gcorr.org. We have lots of resources for folks who want to begin to do the work, and the work begins by coming to a realization. And so I would invite people, as I said, to go to our website, gcorr.org, and you can contact me through that website if you need to. I want to commend you all for the work that you're doing, and thank you for allowing me just some time. I'm going to continue to pray with all of us that we will get this right for Jesus' sake. So thank you, and I'm sorry I have to leave, but thank you for having me. Bye.
Thank you so much, Garlinda. We really appreciate it. And Dr. Daniels does have a resource page that will be made available, and your information will be on there. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you all. God bless.
There. God bless you too. Wayne, there was a question for you. This attendee wants to know if Jesus is brown-skinned.
I think,
and it was directly to you. So
I think from a birth perspective, Jesus had Jewish skin, whatever color it was. But I do not believe that Jesus had racism in any way, form, or fashion in his eyes. He loved and saw all people, regardless of who you are. It said God so loved the world. That included everybody. So I don't believe Jesus had eyes that saw racism, but he saw it. But I mean, he didn't see it through his own eyes. But I think humanly speaking, he had Jewish skin.
And Dr. Daniels, someone wanted to know, could you please define both sides? As we talk about both sides, need to talk about this.
Both sides for me, as I'm speaking, means for folk who have been in the church. And when I say in the church, exposed to the church, you were attending a church, you have experience in the church, even if it was very limited. The other side is going to be persons who will enter the conversation who have little or no experience, but desire to have some experience, have definitive opinions about what should be done. But again, we'll have to be willing to sit at the table and hear from both sides before we can get to an answer.
Okay. We have another question that said, where did it go? It just disappeared. Hold on one second. Any suggestions for having this difficult conversation in a rural, predominantly white congregation as a Black pastor? I'm going to send that to both you and Wayne. Let's start with you, Sherry.
I think that after you give it very, very careful thought, I think that how you approach that conversation is going to be key. my experience tells me that you really need to understand who is able to bring the voices to the table. Who is a person in that community that has the power and the respect of the majority of the community, and also has a heart for doing what is in the greater good for the community, to really get the people on board so that they will come to the conversation at least with an open mind and an open heart to hear what needs to be said. These conversations, I believe, are classified as hard because few of us want to hear what is being said if it is contrary to what we believe. And so these are never easy conversations. We all have an opinion, but at some point we have to have an opinion, but also have an openness to hear what others think, what others are saying, and what is actually in reality going on in our world. So the conversations must be had, but I think you need to do some conversing before you bring the larger group together, so that you can have a framework to work out of. Wayne actually started us off this evening, Barbara, by reminding us of what John Wesley would ask over and over to center us. Do no harm, do good, and stay in love with God. And so we have to figure out, how do we frame the conversations? How do we help people to understand that when you come for the conversation, this is not an argument. This really is us having dialogue, conversation, us sharing where we are. And one of the biggest things is getting beyond our fear of saying what we think and what we believe, for fear that someone will disagree or that we will have to be in a huge argument about it. With that said, Wayne, let me turn to you, because I'm sure you will add something to that.
Well, I think you did very well in articulating the genesis of what the approach that needs to be done in a local congregation in that situation. I think that one of the things I would add to that, I would start with, if you had youth in my congregation, I would have a conversation with them. I find they have a very unique perspective and feel very, very differently. Like you said, these are the people that are on the streets and walking, I think as well, that you find what I call the coalition of the willing. People that you've been in conversation are interested, and start having that conversation there. I think you also are great if you would invite some other local United Methodist churches that are nearby, wherever you are, that have a desire to have light conversation, so that you are starting from that strength of people who have a common desire to be able to have conversation, whether they agree or disagree.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cedrick, can I bring you into the conversation and get you to respond also?
Why, certainly, of course. I agree with what has been said, and I think the first thing is to be aware that God has not given us a spirit of fear. And so whatever fear it is we're exhibiting as it relates to these conversations is not of God, first of all. So I think we need to acknowledge that. And I think, our church is so tied to economy and to economics that our economy gets in the way of our ethic. And so I think we have to make a decision that regardless of what happens to our economy, we have to do the ethical thing. And we have to have conversations about the tough subjects. And I don't really think they're tough subjects so much as it's just real people's lives and the way people live. And I think it's shameful upon all of us, that we live our lives out in the community, out in the world, and we don't have a real say about who we interact with in the grocery store or who we run into in our local department store. Whoever's there when we get there are there. If we happen to speak to them, we happen to speak to them. But when it comes time for us to decide how we're going to order our spiritual lives, we go into our boxes, into our enclaves and whatnot, and protect ourselves and pretend that we're safe, that we're okay. And we also convince ourselves that we all believe the same and we all behave the same. And so I think we can challenge those notions, no matter if we're in an urban setting, a rural or suburban setting, and really just be honest about who we are and where we are, and accept the fact that we don't all believe the same. And with that, I saw this bumper sticker not too long ago that said, "Don't believe everything you think." And that has just really stuck with me, right? Because there are a lot of things that we think that we suddenly, attribute to belief. And we believe that rural spaces are non-hospitable to diversity. We believe that rural spaces are hospitable to diversity, and those things are not true. I live in the center of LA. I'm sitting in Faith United Methodist Church right now. You see this roof damage up here, and along with that, you see this Last Supper montage of African-American sheroes and heroes that are there. Sitting in this church down the hall, in the fellowship hall, there's a group of young Black professionals having a conversation about what they are going to do in their various sectors of industry around this city to move the needle on racial justice. Just about an hour or so ago, the lawn was filled with people from all racial and ethnic backgrounds, and our bishop was here doing a litany over our city and our conference. There was a Baptist brother in the sanctuary, preaching the paint off the walls. All of that was happening. But I'm struck by the fact that I'm also sitting in this church that has a red AIDS ribbon on the tower out front, for this was the first and the only Black United Methodist Church in all of Los Angeles that offered any sort of response in the midst of the HIV/AIDS crises in the mid to late 80s. And so geography is important, but proximity and ethic matters even more.
Jason, there's another question for you that Judy wants to know. As a Black man in America and the United Methodist Church, how do you think the church can impact what is going on with the protests and changing the face of racism?
Barbara, who are you addressing that one to?
Oh, I'm sorry, that's for Cedrick. I'm sorry, it was directed to Cedrick.
Oh, I thought you were asking Jason.
No, I'm sorry, I said Jason, didn't I? Oh, I'm sorry, I meant to say Cedrick. My mistake, I know, that would have been interesting, right? Judy is asking Cedrick.
I love it.
Let me read it again then so we can make sure we're clear. Judy is asking Cedrick, as a Black man in America and in the United Methodist Church, how do you think the church can impact what is going on with the protests and changing the face of racism?
I think the church can impact by joining in the protests and being a voice in the protests. I think the church can follow the lectionary, the gospel lectionary text from today, where Jesus was going about healing and saving folk. But in the midst of that, he looked out upon them and he had compassion for them, which to me says that Jesus saw them in a different way. Even though he was going about doing his ministry the way he had been doing it, something happened that caused him to see them differently. And that text goes on to talk about them being helpless and harassed. Well, if we haven't seen it before, we definitely see it now, where Black people are helpless and harassed. And I keep saying it over and over again, that I think the church has to step into the space and acknowledge that racism is not Black people's problem. So stop asking us to solve it.
Thank you.
It's not our problem.
And and to follow up with that, Sherry, this one is for you, because I think this is really indicative, this question about how we're trying to understand this conversation. Alex wants to know what kinds of conversations that need to happen aren't happening now. Who should we be talking to?
Okay, and Alex, thank you for asking that. But can I go back just a little bit and dip into the portion that was asked of Cedrick about Black men?
Mm-hmm.
As a Black female that is in ministry and pastoring the church, I have something to say about the role of Black men and how racism impacts them. It is true that racism is insidious. It is true. And we don't have to argue the point that it exists, not only in the world, but it exists in our church, in our denomination. Let's just clear the table of that conversation. It is real. It is here. It's like the virus, the COVID-19, the coronavirus. You know, that's a crazy argument. Does it exist? We have lost now almost 120,000 people to this virus. So it is real. That is real. Here's the issue that I have when we start to talk about how this impacts African-American men. And the problem is that, yes, it impacts African-American men, but we must also realize that the impact is not just on Black men, it is also Black women, Black children. And so it keeps trickling on down. It keeps weaving through the full life of the community. So we need to have a place to start, true, and I totally agree, but we cannot ignore all of the community that is being impacted. And more specifically, for my Black brothers, for Black men, I believe that the church should stand up and speak the truth in love and expect that the community is going to respond the way that it should. Here's my other expectation. I also expect for the African-American men in our lives and in our communities to be a part of the church and the full community. And I have to say that as a pastor, because it is hard for us to have a real conversation when we are not present. And so I believe that we need to be present in all areas. So just as we should come out of those sacred walls and move into the streets and be with the people, love the people with our whole hearts, we need the people to also move beyond mistrust of the institutionalized church and come on the inside and work with us, help us to do better, help us to be more Christ-like. Now that was my sermon for today. I didn't get to preach because it was graduation day for our church. And so I had to get my sermon in some kind of way.
You had to get your sermon in this way, right?
But I believe that there is hope. And I believe this is where the hope is, because it gives us the opportunity to extend that invitation to say, you know what? Here is a time when we can all come together because we know that something must happen. Now, the question you asked me specifically, Barbara, was
about who are we talking to? What kinds of conversations that need to happen aren't happening now, and who should we be talking to?
The beauty of this moment and the conversation that we're having is that for us this evening, we're talking about race relations, power, and the role of the church. But this issue of racism covers so many areas in our lives. Racism not only covers our spiritual lives, but it is also impacting our health. We talked about 120,000 people having lost their lives to this virus, and we can unpack that in all of our communities, rural, urban, wherever, in terms of health, because some of the lives that were not lost just because of the virus. They were lost because a lot of communities didn't have access to the tests that they needed or health care that needed to be provided so that their lives could be saved and should have been saved. So that's a conversation that we have to have. I believe, Alex, when you asked that, I think we have to have a sensitivity to and be in tune with our communities to such an extent that we can kind of figure out where our priorities must lie, and then start with the conversations that we absolutely must have, and then work our way through the rest of the conversations. What we do know is that there are so many that we will not be at a loss for conversation.
So this next question is going to lead us into our next segment, which is answering the question, is there racism? And does it really exist? So the question is from George Nicholas, and this is going to be for Wayne and for Sherry to answer. George wants to know, what does it mean that we agree or not agree as it relates to racism? Is there disagreement that systemic racism exists? United Methodist Church must embrace it as a historical and current fact, and then begin conversation on how we're going to dismantle racism and white supremacy that exists in the church and the nation. Now, I know the two of you have your own personal stories also to talk about and answer the question, is racism still an issue in our country, communities, and churches? So these two questions, I think, kind of dovetail together. So Sherry, since you've been talking, let me let Wayne start and then come to you.
That's good.
Wayne, you have to unmute yourself. Unmute yourself, please. There you go.
Well, there's no doubt in my mind that racism exists. I have seen it all of my life. There was a time in my life in my teens that I was a part of it. And I confess that openly and honestly.
Wow.
Even though I might have tried to, act like, well, these people are worse than I am, that, it was on me. And I chose to make a step forward, and I became a Christian soon after that. And that changed and radically changed how I felt about race. And I was raised in an area where racism was really strong. To go back, since we've been having this conversation with Dr. Daniels, I've been going back and remembering my life in the context of racism. And I remember a story that I'll share, that I'm kind of segueing my story a little bit, where I saw it in the church. When you're a superintendent and you go somewhere and somebody pulls you aside and says, "Superintendent, can I talk to you for a minute?" You're in trouble. And so I went aside, and the person said to me, he said, "Now, Mr. Superintendent, there are some people that have their churches, and then there's other people that have their churches. And those people ought to go to their churches, and we ought to go to our churches. And we shouldn't be inviting one another to come to one of those churches." Now, I got that message loud and clear from a layperson standing out on the front of the church property. And I knew then that everybody in that church, or many of them in that church, had that same belief. I was appalled that someone would say that, and then again, I wasn't, based on looking at my past. I think it's true in communities. I see it every day in different ways. I liked what Dr. Bridgeforth said about economics. I really see it in economics. We don't mind economics as long as it's in our favor. And we're supposed to be a generous people. We're supposed to be in mission together. One of the things that I see, I've talked a lot about this in the Board of Mission, it's time that the United Methodist Church, and I'm talking about my own district, it's time we stop closing churches in poor, predominantly African-American neighborhoods and building white churches out in suburbia.
I see Cedric's waving his hand there when you say that.
That's true, is that we're starting a new faith community in a poor community, and we've made sure that the economics of it is not going to be a problem. It's long term, because you don't start in a community with that much need and spiritual desire and hunger, along with so many other needs, by just saying, "Oh, well, just give us a little grant, I hope it all work out in the end." That's the economics of failure, is that, while we're flourishing in other places because we're afraid of investing the money that can be a powerful transforming presence in a community, and the ways the church should be and could be in that community. And I see that all the time. But I lived in Washington, D.C. for a long time. And I'll tell you what, politically, People are there as long as it means that you can give me a vote. And they'll jump on any bandwagon, but let that bandwagon dissipate and it'll be moving on. If we don't change that, then the institution, whether it's judicial, whether it's economic, whether it's penal systems, no matter what you want to talk about, if we don't change it there from whoever can get the most votes and show themselves, then we're going to be in trouble. Because it's deeply embedded in who is making those votes and who they're listening to.
Okay, Sherry, is there racism still? I'm going to let you speak, and then I have a series of questions for both of you.
Okay. I believe that I can get a whole lot in on my 10 minutes that I have, because I have said, yes, it exists. Yes, it is insidious. Yes, it is untenable. Yes, it is agitating and irritating now for everybody. It has always been, but it's more so now. And absolutely, if we don't do something about it, then God is not going to be pleased, and we will all be held accountable. So if you want to know where I stand, what I think about racism, it's real, it's here, we deal with it every day. I've been dealing with it every day all of my life. There were years that I didn't know I was dealing with it, but I have dealt with it, am dealing with it, still deal with it, will be probably dealing with it tomorrow. Well, more than likely I will. So yes, it is real, and that is not an argument. Now, you can have that argument with yourself if you want to have it, but you cannot have it with me, because there's nothing to argue. It's just like air. You may not see it, but it's there, period. My personal story is this. Wayne had a story which I thought was really interesting and brave of him to share, that someone would come to him and absolutely say, now, you know, those folk have their church and we have ours, and the rest of the story. Here's my story. I can remember serving in a conference in our denomination, and I've had the joy of serving in 3. So none of you will be able to figure out which conference I'm talking about, but in one of the conferences that I served in, I was serving on conference staff and was assigned a particular area to train and equip local churches. And I was sent out to a church far from the conference center and its office. And when I arrived at the church, and the team of persons there that were assigned to greet me met me at the door, one of the lay persons in the church, who happened to be female, she greeted me by saying this, and I mean no offense to anyone, but I need to use the language that she used so that you can understand where I'm coming from. She greeted me by saying, "Is this our little nigger preacher today? Well, we so glad you're here." And I can't explain to anybody the expression on my face, but I can tell you what went on in my spirit. When I went to that particular church, I had gone to school, I had earned a bachelor's degree, I had gone to seminary, I had earned a master's of divinity degree, I had gone a little further and had earned a doctorate of ministry degree. And I was thinking to myself, am I yet again going to be greeted with this? Am I yet again going to be called out of my name and not by my proper name, and called something that I am not? In my own church, the church that I love. And I hate to say that that was over 25 years ago. I also hate to say that I believe that that same attitude, that same spirit is still present in our church, and now is the time for us to start to deal with it very truthfully. And I agree that everybody's entitled to their opinion. They are entitled to think what they want to think, but I also think that in the midst of what we feel we are entitled to, there is a moral imperative that we should all live by. And we all know in our spirits when we have done something that is absolutely wrong. We know when we have mistreated someone. And I don't believe that we are naive to that. So we all have a responsibility to do something about that. I did not allow that experience to cause me to leave this denomination and go someplace else, because I'm very clear what I experience in my denomination, I could go to any denomination and experience the same thing. So the problem is even deeper and more insidious than we know, in my humble opinion.
Okay, we've got a bunch of questions that have come through.
Lord.
So, yes. Who just called me? Okay. Let me start with, actually, I want to start with, hold on one second. This came from George, and this is to everybody. And Cedrick, I'm bringing you into the conversation with Sherry and with Daniel, okay? All right, George says, you don't need to create new church starts in the Black communities if you invest in the pastors who have dedicated their lives to serving in these communities in existing churches that have not been supported by the conference. Support the churches that are doing the work right now. Why don't we start with you, Reverend Snead, in answering that question. And unmute yourself. Don't forget.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Some people might think it's better for me to be muted. So, I think that was a critical issue to talk about economics. I know we have worked very hard from a cabinet perspective and taking that into consideration when we are working in communities. I think that is an issue where in our conference, I think about, the CF&A, I think about the church development team. I think of churches investing in churches. I think it's investing in leadership in those churches as well. Not only clergy leadership, but also lay leadership. Many times people can't afford to have people come in and work with them. That's why Focus 2020 was what we were trying to focus on with that and with renewal and building up Black churches. But the amount of money there, I think they're right. I just want to say that. I think they're right. I think it's both though. I don't think it's in the area where I'm talking about. I'm not talking about a place that has a church to get behind. I'm talking about, but if we have churches, then we need to put the resources there. If you don't have the resources there, it is economics. Let's be honest about it. Is that, and go ahead.
Sherry, you're working in the Black church in the community. What do you think?
Absolutely. Well, this is really an interesting conversation because I serve at that local church level and will find myself feeling many times just like the person who asked, why are we investing in a new start when we already have churches that are present and struggling, and we should be investing more dollars in those churches? I absolutely agree. I think we've come to a point where we do have to assess, is it a both and? Have we done the legwork and the groundwork to say and or establish that the church that is in the community currently is healthy enough to do the work that needs to be done? I think someone mentioned earlier serving in a church, it may have even been Garlinda, where the leadership in that church had not changed in so long that the church was very much entrenched in doing things its own way. That's true in many of our churches. That's true in the vast majority of our churches. And we have to say this with all fairness, it's also true in our African American churches. And so we have to look at, is there anything that's hindering us from being all we can be and doing all we can do? On the flip side, and respectfully saying this to my district superintendent, and I happen to know that the bishop is also listening in. I know that you all deal with many things around that cabinet table, but I think it is essential that before we do anything in the community, that conversations be had with the pastors that are serving in those communities, because we will have a context and experience in terms of the people that are in the community that are being served in that community that could possibly influence what you will do as it relates to any new starts that will take place. And so that's a delicate dance. No one has an answer fully to that, but I think that it just should be something that we put in this conversation that has to be heard by the majority of the people. This movement that we're going through now, this forcement that we have gone through in terms of this conversation on race, power, and the role of the church, this was not on anybody's agenda back in January of 2020. This has swelled up from the ground up because of a crisis, several crises. And so right now, we all have to be very careful not to make decisions in how we are moving forward that are not going to be in line with what we really need in our communities. So I do encourage Wayne, you, all your colleagues, that your peers that sit around that table, making those real difficult decisions, that as you're doing that you all continue to engage the pastors that are on the front lines, that's out in that mission field, so that you can have a better view of what is going on. And I need to add this. And I do understand that as pastors in the field, we could have a limited view of everything that's in the field, but for sure, there is something that we can share that may help you make your decision better.
Okay. Cedrick, do you want to add something to that before I go into the next question?
Of course I do. I think, yeah, I love that question, and I think it really begins to get at the heart of this discussion that we're trying to have today. And that is, for me, it is a both and. It's about investing in the places of ministry that we already have established, but also investing in places where we do not yet or continue to have presence. But I think the conversation needs to go to a deeper level. I think, too often we start the conversation about what the church can do as opposed to starting the conversation with what the community actually needs. Because just given this present age that we find ourselves in with COVID-19, with racism, the church, almost going to hell in a handbasket, except for the intervention of God Almighty, then, we have an opportunity while we're on pause to re-envision and to reimagine the ways in which we go about doing what we do. And so for me, the conversation, is not just about evangelism, but it's about empowerment and emancipation. The conversation is not just about apportionments, but it's also about reparations. So as we look at starting new churches or new ministry centers or branching into forgotten, lost, or never even explored mission fields, we have to start with what are the needs that exist and what can we actually bring to bear in those settings that are requested, needed, and can honor the resource that already exists. But again, beginning with emancipation and empowerment alongside of evangelism. I don't think we can afford as a church to untangle those three while we deal with the economics of apportionment and all that other stuff. We also have to entangle reparations, because all of our churches, everything that's been built in this country has been built on the backs of Black people, Black labor, and exploited histories of our Native American siblings.
So you're the preacher at the church in California? Are you the pastor?
Not of this particular church. I just came over here to get caught up in what was being stirred today. I pastor a different church here in the city.
I tell you, because I want to come hear your sermon. Anyway, I have a question here from Andrea. She wants to know, as an African-American leader in a predominantly white church, how to stand up in an environment, church, where you could experience some strong pushback as it relates to the conversation of race and people not thinking racism is not in the church, and where you may be loved by the pastor and other leaders, that love decreases with laypersons. How do you continue to be an effective leader? Let's let Sherry, why don't you tackle that one first?
Okay. Well, you know what? Unfortunately, the majority of us, if you are a person of color, particularly African American, you will find yourself in situations where you are, if not one of a few, and sometimes the only one. And so this is a problem and a dilemma that we will always have. I think at some point we have to come to the conclusion, again, the moral imperative. Are you going to do what is right? Are you going to tell the truth and nothing but the truth? And we can only do that from where we are spiritually. So if what is going on in the church is not right, if it is something that should be spoken to, then we're going to have to really gather up our courage and speak truth, as they would say, speaking truth to power. And all the times when we hear the truth and when it is spoken, we may not necessarily like it, but it needs to be spoken, it needs to be articulated, and we need to all be able to deal with it. The other side of that is this, is that when you are faced with that kind of dilemma, I was always taught that this church is a connectional church and that we are connectional for a reason. I was also led to believe that when any part of the church was in trouble, the whole church would stand and stand with you. And I'm still hoping and praying that that is still true. So I believe that when you find yourself in that kind of situation, that you have to then trust God to allow those who will come and those who will stand with you so that you can stand and withstand. It is not going to be easy. It has never been easy. And we just have to determine in our own minds, are we going to speak truth? It's not easy for me as a local pastor serving on a district and my district superintendent, who is my supervisor, for us to co-host this kind of conversation together. It would have been much easier for me to leave this alone and not say to the district superintendent, will you join me for this conversation? I understood where this could go. It could go real right or it could go real wrong. But if we're not willing to take that chance, if we're not willing to have those conversations, then I believe that we're going to be judged accordingly. And so if you're in that position, reach out to someone who can encourage you in your faith, help you with good sound advice, and walk with you as you're walking through that challenge. Make sure that you're not trying to do it all by yourself, because the beauty of our denomination is that you don't have to do it all by yourself. But
Wayne, I see you shaking your head. Yeah, I see you shaking your head, Wayne. You want to add something?
I think Dr. Daniels hit the nail on the head, to tell you the truth. You don't need to go this alone. You need to find some friends. You need to, sit down across the table and have a cup of tea, coffee, or iced tea. I don't care what it is. And start having a conversation with people that you know in the life of the church and who care and love you and for who you are, and have that conversation with them. Try to build some momentum toward having a greater conversation. Just don't go after the people that you know are going to be the hardliners. Is that, you can't be the only voice.
That's right.
Would you like to add anything before we move on?
Sure. Yeah, I would, I love these questions. I'm a fan of these questions. But two things I would just say quickly. One, I believe we are so sensitive. Within the church, we are so sensitive that if anybody says anything in a way that we don't like, we tune it out and turn it off and dismiss it. And I would welcome us to place our that sensitive nature with some sensitivity to the fact that people are hurt, that people have been hurt, and that people have had to walk around in silence with that hurt. And thank God we're at a moment in our history where some people are speaking out. The second thing is to those of the ordained order of elder. And that is for each of us to get out of line, to get it out of our minds, that if we say the right things, that if we do the right things, that somebody's going to tap us on the shoulder and make us the pastor of first whatever, or call us to be a district superintendent, or say that person ought to be a bishop. I think those things get in the way of us exercising our prophetic call and to really stepping into the hard, tough spaces and conversations that God would have us step into to really lead the church and the community and this nation forward.
Okay. All right. Krista has a question. She says, thinking of racism as a systemic issue, how do we confront this with integrity and refuse to bow to intimidation, whether it's our context or fear of an empty offering plate? How do we rebuild our church structure from the top down to operate with integrity, because there is no compromising with racism, individual or systemic, while bearing the name Christian? I'm going to start with you, Wayne, on her question. How do we confront racism with integrity and refuse to bow down to intimidation?
Well, one of the things that I heard recently in dealing with a situation, and I thought it was some wise words, that I don't think you should be intimidated, but I think you need to be able to speak it in such a way, and I think Dr. Bridgeforth said it, he talked about sensitivity, and that we have a very sensitive church. And as Dr. Daniels has said, we're entering to conversations. And so if we don't change, whatever your church chooses to focus on in the midst of whatever layer of racism that they are seeing going on in their community, that they need to get behind that and work on it as a congregation and as a pastor. People is not going to like it. And at some point we got to say, that's okay. Now I hope the bishop's not listening at this point, but that's kind of what I'm saying there. I mean, we have to be a reality and say, if we are always catering to people who are saying, I'm going to take my offering or I'm going to leave or those kind of things, then nothing is going to change, because the power is in the economics, not the power in what is right, not in the power of what Jesus said we needed to be doing as brothers and sisters together. And so we got to be comfortable at some point. And like I said, I'm uncomfortable saying this because I got to make appointments and deal with it. But I think that too long we've been held hostage in some way, that if we speak up for justice, or when we see racism and inequality for whatever it is, especially systemic, then we need to understand that people are not going to like it. And you know what? At some point in time, we need to be okay with that.
Wayne, Barbara, let me add to that too, because Wayne, one of the things that I know has to happen for pastors, leaders, spiritual leaders, and pastors especially, is that we as pastors will have to make that definitive call, that precision cut, when we will make a determination, is the call on my life and the call that God placed on me a call that is deeper than my denomination and the church that I'm currently serving? And will I allow myself to be held hostage by the threat of someone that will shut their pocketbook and hold back their tithes and offerings because they don't like what's going on in the church? Now, here is where my background, my roots, my family, this is where all of this comes up. I was taught in the church to believe that the God we serve is a God that provides. So if someone has the audacity to threaten to shut their pocketbooks, and I have some witnesses that are a part of this conversation because they are members of the Norfolk United Methodist Church, and I do want them to go on chat and verify my testimony. I have said it in the Norfolk Church. If you feel that God is calling you to shut your pocketbook because of an issue that we must work out, discuss, or deal with, then what I want you to do is not only shut your pocketbook, but I think you need to be in another place, because this is probably not the place where God would have you to be. God does not call us to respond that way. And so we have to have a courage and a deepness of our faith that the people that God has called us to serve can witness and see in us, so that they will allow that same courage to well up in them. And so for my pastor colleague, I stand with you. If you got to have that come to Jesus meeting with someone who would make that kind of threat, I can say this: your district superintendent, M. Wayne Snead, he will be right there with you, standing beside you, and I'll be cheering you on. But every now and again, we have to speak the truth, even to the people that we love. And so, no, God calls all of us to be faithful stewards. God calls all of us to do what we do out of love. And, you know, I know that's not always popular. I know that's not even always expedient. But if we don't believe what we preach, if we don't believe what we teach, how will this world change for the better?
Amen.
Barbara, can I add one thing?
Yes, you may. Absolutely.
One of the things a person told me as a pastor a long time ago that I've tried to hold on to is that I need to be in prayer as to when I need to be a pastor and when I need to be a prophet.
Mm-hmm.
And because you can't be a prophet on everything, you can't be a pastor on everything. But you need to pray and ask God, is this some place where I need to be a prophet? And if that's what you believe, then you do it. And because you believe that's what God's calling you to do. That also means that whatever the consequence is going to be that too. That's okay. But if God calls you to do something, you need to do it.
And Wayne, will you take that out a step further for us? Because I do want people to hear, everybody that's listening, I want them to hear us say this. You know, I believe in my heart that when a pastor, particularly a pastor, and the laity will experience this too, but particularly for pastors, when you feel so led and so strong in your spirit that something needs to be done, I believe that in our denomination, as imperfect as it can be at times, I don't believe that God is going to let us stand out on a limb. And when I offered you up and said, I know that Wayne Snead will be there with you, I said it as, you know, lightheartedly, but I meant that because that's what I was taught. When I entered ministry, I was taught that when the bishop put the bishop's hand on my head and said, take thy authority, that had meaning. I also was taught that when I was appointed to serve in a respective district, that I would have a district superintendent who would stand with me. Would that district superintendent hold me accountable? Absolutely. But that district superintendent would stand with me and would stand with me strong and tall if I was standing on the side of right. And I think we need to have pastors that can remember and recall that that's the covenant that we are a part of. There are other clergy that I should be able to call and say, I need you to stand with me. And I should have an expectation that when I put that call out, somebody's going to show up and stand with me.
There is a question for you, Wayne. It says, what do you see as the next action steps for the Elizabeth District regarding race?
And that moves into my content section of that. Should I hold that till then?
Yeah, let's hold that. That's true. Let's hold that until then. Terry, I know you have a poll. We wanted to try to get some opinions from our listeners. Can you put the first poll question up, please? And can you talk about that?
I will. The first poll is going to, after all of this conversation, now we're going to ask you, is the issue of race still a concern in this country that must be addressed in the country and in our communities and church? So let me launch that, and we're going to give you about 35 seconds to respond to it, and then we'll give you the results.
Oh, host and panelists cannot vote. Okay. I was just clicking away.
I was too. I was too.
All right. We have about 76%, 77% of the vote in, and we're going to give it a few more seconds, but it appears to be a runaway that the issue of race is still a concern and something that we must deal with. So we're at about 43, 4, 5, and we're going to end the poll.
Okay. So I want to ask a question of the three of you, because I know that there are probably a lot of people who are sitting there and they're thinking, well, we can just invite the white church to say, we can invite the black church over and we can meet together and talk, or vice versa. Is that enough, and is that going to make the significant change? And I'm going to start with you, Cedrick.
The answer is no. That is not enough, and that's not even the starting place. The starting place is really that deep personal work that needs to happen, and community conversations that need to happen about why things are the way they are, and what is our present capacity to step into those spaces and have those conversations. And so it's not about inviting the black choir to come over to sing, or the hooping black preacher to come over and preach in your sanctuary, but it is about, will you roll up your sleeves and come into that black community and learn of them, teach, and be in community together, and to really listen to what's being spoken, to smell what you can smell in the space, touch what you can touch in the space, and really get in touch with the reality that we are all human, and that all of us come with a variety of struggles. But some of us have a variety of struggles that we did not choose and that we cannot eradicate on our own. And I think we only get that by sharing space together, and by those who have assumed power or sit in spaces of power, predominance, if you will, coming out of those spaces and into those other places and offering themselves as ears and as hands and as feet to listen, to serve alongside, and to walk alongside. And one last thing I'll add to that is I would put some of the onus on our denominational leaders. I served as a district superintendent for 8 years, so I'll own some of this too. We will send women, particularly black women, to Anglo congregations. We'll send women of other racial ethnic groups to Anglo congregations. We'll send African-American males to Anglo congregations. But I think in my 22 years of pastoral service, I've seen that happen in reverse twice. And it was because nobody else wanted to go to these two particular places. And both of them are closed today. And so I think if we're going to have open itinerancy, it needs to be open for everyone. And to not sit on the side of, if we send this person there, we're going to lose this church. For far too often, we've settled into the complacity of what was comfortable and what was right for the bigots, and we have not settled in the space of what was righteous for the best and for the most.
Okay, Wayne, same question.
Say the question again. I was so entrenched, and I was listening to Dr. Richard, so I was just sucking it in. I was just drinking it up. So
the question was, if the church, if churches say, if the white church says we're going to invite the black church over and we're going to meet together, and vice versa, is that enough? Is that going to be the impetus for change?
we've been doing that for a long time. and we ain't gotten anywhere yet. So do I think that's going to be, I mean, that might be a nice kind of thing that you do, but it's not going to change or move the ball forward. I think Dr. Bridgeforth said it is the idea of having community and really sitting down and getting to know what you have walked in your life with and what kind of things are happening in your life and having that conversation, because a lot of persons, and I'll say particularly white persons, have no idea what it's like and what it's been like to be a Black person in society and all the things that they've had. They have no idea. And so I think that if I would say a quote of a person said one time, God gave us 2 ears and 1 tongue. You need to listen more and shut up. And I think that we need to listen. It's time to listen. Put the defensiveness down. I mean, you know, don't try to justify. Listen and understand.
Dr. Daniels?
Okay. Jason is helping me with this. We have one attendee with their hand up, and so I'm trying to figure out who that is. But look, Barbara, if it worked for Wayne, it'll work for me too. Summarize that question again. Is it enough that if we just go and visit and have a kumbaya moment and have a potluck?
Exactly.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It's not enough if you're talking about a Black church in a Black community. That's just not enough. We have to get to the place where we will extend ourselves so that we are able to develop relationships, lasting, trusting relationships, so that what we do is not just what my grandmother used to refer to as a flash in the pan. And in order to do that, you have to have time. You have to really understand who you are serving. You have to do your very best to serve them. And you're right. This weariness that we speak of, you know, we're weary of the potluck dinners where we go sit around the table, we tell the nice stories, we try not to offend one another, and then we go back home and we do the same thing over and over again. When we end our conversation tonight, and we really don't have that much time left, so Barbara, we're going to have to adjust a little bit. But when we end it tonight, I'm actually going to end it with a benediction that was prayed at our 1968 General Conference by Bishop Woody White. It floored me that when I pulled it up, he spoke this in 1996. And when I started to do the math, that's over 20 years ago. And why in the world would we still be saying the same words 20 years later? The words should be a little different. So no, we have to be willing. We have to want to get to know our neighbors. We have to want to get to know the people. We have to learn their stories, respect their stories, and not judge. We had a question earlier, and Barbara, we may have missed it. I'm gonna try to weave it in.
Okay.
Someone wanted to know how they could trust the United Methodist Church when we had come out publicly from what could be perceived from the news media that we were not allowing or were against persons who practice an alternative lifestyles or were gay, lesbian, LBGQ, and I'm not doing it all politically correct, but you all know where and what I speak of. And she wanted to know, how can we trust you? How can we love you? Well, a little of what you're asking, a lot of what you're asking has a lot to do with what she just said. When you invite us in, you need to know who you're inviting in. When you invite us in, when we come together, we need to know what kind of conversation we're really going to have. You know what? You may be saying one thing to me, but my real problem may be that I can't pay my rent. I don't have health insurance. I'm coughing. I have to go to work. I cannot shelter at home because I don't have the kind of job that will allow me to shelter at home. and you want me to go to church on Sunday too, and put something in the offering plate when it comes by. And so our start has to be to understand the hurt and the pain that is present in our communities, and try to get a handle on who we're serving, so that when we do come together for conversation, we can talk.
We've got to be able to do that. And we are running out of time. So I want to make sure that we can get to, let's do our second poll question right now. And then we will transition into some calls for action.
All right, let me, okay.
There it is.
I was sharing, okay,
Yeah, that's
so
the results.
here it is. It's, no, it's not. I'm trying to get to the poll question number 2. Okay, I have to stop that. I'm sorry, y'all. I'm following the technology. I'm trying to get the poll.
We love technology. We do.
I'm sorry. I wasn't trained for
But
that.
let me while you work on that, let me ask a question of Cedrick and Wayne, because a lot of the congregation, and you guys have spoken very openly about this, is that the congregation's getting older. And a lot of times, and I'm of a certain age at this point, but a lot of times we let older people off the hook because, oh, that's just how they were raised. Oh, that's just where they're coming from. Oh, it's not a big deal. Should we be letting people off the hook when it comes to racism? Because if we keep letting people off the hook, will we keep perpetuating it to the younger generation, even if we don't intend, even if that's not our intent? Cedrick.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that question. Yeah, I don't think we let people off the hook. I think we're living in the middle of a very historic and critical moment that demonstrates for us that letting people off the hook is cowardice and ungodly. And what I mean by that is 3 months ago, you couldn't pay churches to do anything online. Most people said, well, we can't, send out anything because most of our folks don't have email and they don't have computers and all that. COVID-19 hit. The bishop sent out an edict and said, y'all better not gather in those churches. And suddenly, overnight, everybody was online. Even in my own church, Emma Lindsay, God bless her soul, with her flip phone, she had her kids go out and get her an iPad. And she sits up on worship and Bible study and prayer meeting and everything. So we give people that hook upon which to hang their biases, to hang their bigotry, to hang their complacency. And I believe the church, if it's doing its prophetic, truly evangelical work, then we remove those hooks and we turn them into chains that allow us to bind ourselves together, and we all move forward together doing that which is for the greater good. So I think this technology boom shows us that if we can move into the 21st century as it relates to technology in our worship, we can move into the 21st century and provide leadership as it relates to race relations and, dare I call it, basic human dignity and decency for this present age.
Wayne, I want to add to that, and then we'll go to the poll.
Well, I think we're at a tipping point. I look at my younger children who are fed up, totally fed up, have no tolerance for older persons or me as their parents. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear that somehow or another this is the way they were raised, whatever. It's time. And they'll speak with their feet, but they'll also speak with their vote. Mm-hmm. They're action oriented. They're about doing something about it. And I love to see that.
Okay. Are we ready for the poll?
We are.
Okay, let's go to that.
The pastor is learning some new things. The panelists, you will be allowed to vote this time. I'm getting ready to launch this one. The second poll is, are you hopeful about the future hope of our church? And I'm going to launch our poll right now.
We have results coming in.
They are. We have about 6 to 8% of our vote in. And unfortunately, for those of you who are viewing by Facebook and YouTube, you're not able to vote in our poll, but some have asked as they've had to log off or they had to leave the conversation. You know, they want to know about future conversations. And Jason, we are going to share with them the landing page for the district page for sure, so that as people want to be included in the database, that we can make sure that we have a good mailing list to send this out to not only those who registered, but to anybody and everybody that wants to attend. All right, so we're going to end the poll now, and I will be getting the results. And right now, we can see that about 66% are hopeful, about 21% are somewhat hopeful, 11% are not sure. So I believe that, and I'm sharing the results now. I believe that Mr. District Superintendent Wayne, that's given us a clear indication that we have a lot of work to do in our district and in our conference as a whole. I'm encouraged that 66% are, but it still gives me a reason for pause when I see the somewhats and the not sures.
Okay. We've learned a lot, we've heard a lot, but the question is, what now? You know, once the protests stop, once things start to go back to quote unquote normal, whatever our new normal is, what are we going to do about it? What's going to be different? So I want to ask each of our panelists to come up with your final call to action, and also wrap into that your final thoughts, because by that time we will be at the top of the hour, and we really want to be respectful of people's time. We know that giving us 2 hours on a Sunday evening is a very special thing. So we thank you for that very much. Let's start with Reverend Snead.
Well, mine, I just want to make sure I was off mute. I was having a conversation with a Black friend of mine the other day, and I asked them how they felt about the protest in terms of seeing real change happen. How hopeful are they to see real change? Because we both felt we were at a tipping point. They made a comment that they said, "I'm hopeful, but I don't get my hopes up. Too many times I have thought things would change, but after a while, they went back to the way things were. Nothing really changed." That's a scary thought for me. That we could see so much movement and so much potential, and to allow it just to be snuffed out by time or the next thing that comes along, that would be a tragedy. One of the biggest concerns for me in terms of our action is I am deeply concerned by systemic change and the need for it. When I watched Just Mercy, it brought my soul down. There was a depth that of conviction, of a reality that I had never experienced at that deep a level. Because I see, whether it's judicial, political, educational, economic, there is a bias that is there. Unfortunately, many people don't see themselves as racist because they measure themselves against a standard that they are not as bad as other people. Therefore, since they are not worse than those other racist people, then they don't see themselves as racist. The very attitude and rationalization nullifies the pursuit of real change. The "we are not as bad" attitude helps fuel racism because there's nothing for them to talk about. I believe this is one of the most insidious sins that's out there today. It's not me, it's them.
Mhm.
I think the bishop in her letter to us talked about call to actions. We need informed clergy and laity to have authentic conversations about race and reconciliation in houses of worship, communities, and workplaces in which we acknowledge racism as a sin and actively pursue whatever is necessary to dismantle the injustices. Community policing emphasizes working with neighborhood residents as partners in creating public safety, she said. We can offer our support and involvement with law enforcement agencies that want to work with the community residents to identify problems and collaborate with implementing solutions that produce meaningful results for the community. We can encourage civilian participation and oversight in our first responders and our law enforcement in order to strengthen trust in the community. Every community should define the appropriate form and structure of civilian oversight to meet the needs of that community. That's the next steps, paths we need to go forward on.
Okay, thank you so very much. Mr. Bridgeforth, Reverend Bridgeforth.
Yes, thank you. Very quickly, I don't serve in the Elizabeth District, but I would. After this conversation, I would. A couple things. One, when I hear people ask about the church and particularly, about the future of the church and the perspective of the church, I think all too often we let ourselves off the hook by not recognizing that we are the church. When we talk about the United Methodist Church, all of us who are professing members are the United Methodist Church. So wherever it goes depends on where our hearts lie. And as far as next steps, I think two things is asking ourselves, am I willing and am I able to express compassion to my brothers and my sisters and my siblings in the world? Another call to action would be something simple as having a conversation within your context, within your families, within your neighborhoods, and yes, even within your congregations. You could have a critical conversation just like this one. And if you're afraid of it being as free-flowing as this has been, then you could make it a book study. You could make it a book study and focus on books like White Fragility or How to Be Anti-Racist. You could even garner a conversation or gather a conversation around a movie or a documentary. Dr. Snead just mentioned Just Mercy. You could watch it and have a conversation about it. You could watch The Help and have a conversation about it. You could watch the documentary 13th and have a conversation about it. Just to begin to hear one another so that you can truly see each other. And I think that'll help us move us out of this space of saying, well, I'm not a racist. Well, you may not be, but are you complicit with racist systems and racial bias or even unknown biases that you carry that help you make decisions every single day? And I never, ever want to hear anybody say to me ever again that I'm not racist because I never owned slaves. Well, my response to that is I was never a slave. However, I bear the brunt of that horrible system just as well as many bear the gains from those atrocities that came at the hand of a system that still is yet present in a day when one man feels so confident in who he is and the power that he possesses that for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, he could sit still and others could sit by complicit in that act. And all of them, I guarantee you, will tell you this day, I'm not a racist. No, you may not be, but are you complicit?
Thank you very, very much. Before I turn this over to Dr. Daniels for her final comments and the benediction, I just want to say, first of all, that I am honored to have helped to serve in this critical conversation. I just want, many of you were talking on chat about what can I read, where can I go, what should I do? And I want to invite you to listen to Another View, which is heard on NPR in the Hampton Roads area and throughout the internet on our website, anotherviewradio.org. We're on live every Thursday at noon, where we discuss today's issues from an African-American perspective. If you truly want to learn, this is a good, safe space to come and to learn about what is happening in the community. And please think about this, because a lot of your Black, excuse me, African-American congregants, members of your churches, they're hurting. Don't add the additional burden of having them to try to teach you about racism. Learn on your own. There's plenty of books out there to read. There are plenty of movies, as Dr. Bridgeforth just said, to watch or to participate in conversations. Do your homework and then start to have the conversation, because it is unfair to put yet another burden on a group of people that are already so burdened. Thank you so very much. My name is Barbara Hamm-Lee. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Sherry Daniels to give her steps of action going forward and to give us our benediction. Dr. Daniels.
Very good. And thank you, Barbara. One of the things that was real clear once we decided we were going to have this conversation was that when you have, let me count, 1, 2, 3, 4 preachers, you better have a moderator. And I knew that you could handle all of us and keep us timely and keep us on point. And so God bless you for the work. And some of you who may not know Barbara personally, she has a history and an experience of the United Methodist Church. Amen. So she knows us and she loves us.
Yes,
also,
I do.
There are resources that will be shared through the landing page that Jason is going to be posting for you. And we want to get that to everybody that we can. We have also included a link for you to go to the IB Press website. They're offering a free book. So you can get your first book free. You don't even have to pay the shipping. So there are no excuses. You can just go on, decide which one you want, and start right there. So that's something that we can do. Let me also piggyback on Dr. Bridgeforth, because he said you can pick out a movie. You could pick out Ava DuVernay's 13th documentary and decide to do that as a study, a guided study. Well, Virginia Focus 2020, we've done homework on that, and we have, through the partnership with the General Board of Church and Society, we have already created a study guide to go along with that documentary. So you don't have to do the heavy lifting on that. We'll get you started real good, as my grandmother would say. And so if you want information on that, I'm going to provide that information to Jason so that it can be posted on the website, but the resources are there. So let me get to my call to action. The first thing I would say under my call to action is that when you know something needs to be done, just go on and do it. I can guarantee you that as we were pulling this critical conversation together, the only thing I knew was that it needed to happen. And when I decided that if I asked my district superintendent and he says yes, then that means that we need to move forward. God bless his soul, he said yes. And so I had to figure out how to make it happen. Has it been easy? Absolutely not. Has it been worth it? Absolutely. Because guess what? Everything that I didn't get perfect this time, we're going to work on it and we're going to make it better the next time. So if you're waiting for perfection, if you're waiting for all the answers to do anything, you'll never do, you'll never do anything if you're waiting to have all of the answers and the perfect plan to start. Have the heart and trust God to work out and help you bring together a team that will help you execute what is on your heart. So 4 things that I lift up for you beyond what I've said. And I'm borrowing this from Dr. Emmanuel Cleaver, who was the preacher today at the Church of the Resurrection in Kansas. He lifted 4 things, concrete things that we can do. And I tend to agree with them. He said, first of all, we can speak up when others make racially insensitive comments. In other words, the time is long gone for us to ignore or for us to excuse away inappropriate statements and behavior. And it is time for us to call people to account and to call out their shortcomings. It is not appropriate for you to use the N-word. It's not appropriate for anybody to use the N-word. So we need to call people to account, including ourselves. It is no longer acceptable for us to think that the color of one's skin will dictate or relegate them to a place in society. That is not our call to make. God created us all in God's image. And the Bible says that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. We have to ask ourselves, do we believe that? I believe it. The second thing he lifted up, he says that we can advocate for diversity in corporate boardrooms. While I am a true advocate of good preaching, I can say this: after you have preached the sermon, you're going to have to go and make sure that things happen in the places where it matters and where you can get the work done. So we have to have diversity, and we have to have that moral imperative at work, not only in our sanctuaries, but they must be at work in our boardrooms where those critical decisions are made. And so we need to monitor that. We need to keep up with that. We need to make sure that we are fully educated and know what is going on. My stewardship now is being influenced by how the corporate entities and businesses are making their decisions. I'm not a faithful steward if I am helping to fund racist thoughts, behaviors, and actions. Enough said on that. So we need to be mindful of that, and we need to be knowledgeable. Thirdly, we need to engage and support African-American arts, literature, reading, viewing of our television shows, broadcasts that are produced. It may be produced for a predominantly African-American audience or Latino audience, but that does not mean that we cannot all view, that we cannot all experience, and that we cannot all learn. We need to embrace our plays and dance. I cannot say that enough. It is insensitive and it is wrong that when we don't have a respect for someone's culture and their context, then we need to do a self-examination and a self-check. And so we do need to support that. And then lastly, we need to put our resources where our conviction is. Better said, you need to put your money where your mouth is. Amen. The Bible says where your treasure, treasure is, there is your heart also. Did I misquote it? Because it's late on Sunday night.
That's it.
Let me just say this. Faithful stewardship calls us to be faithful across the board. So we need to be prayerful and discern where, God, can I allow the resources that you have blessed me with to be a blessing for others and for the community and for the world. I just ask that you just keep that in your consideration, and that you consider that there are more organizations at work beyond United Way, beyond the groups that we know and hear about. Look for those small grassroots organizations that are trying to do the work in the community, in the immediate community, in the streets, Barbara, as you talked about earlier. Look for them as well. It does not have to be either or. It can be both and. So those are the 4 calls to action that I would present to you. And again, thanking you, we're about a minute over, for joining us in this initial conversation. I can tell you this, I will have conversation with my district superintendent about the continuation of the conversations and how they need to be played out. But
Reverend Dan, just real quick, before you wrap up, may I just say just one more thing that I forgot to say, and this is really, really important. I want to say to you, Reverend Snead, thank you, because in my 62 years of living, I have never had a white man say I was a part of the problem. It took my breath away when you said I was racist or I did racist actions. And so I just want to thank you for your honesty, because that's where we have to start, with true honesty. So I just wanted to say that, and I'm sorry for interrupting.
Well, I want to say one thing. I wanted to make sure I give Dr. Bridgeforth a chance to get an appointment in Virginia on the Elizabeth River District.
Amen.
Amen. All right, Dr. Daniels, bring us home.
All right, I'm going to bring us home. First, to all of you who have been a part this afternoon and this evening, thank you for your contribution. Thank you for your participation. Thank you. And for restoring my faith that if you feel led and called to do something, if you do it, you can trust God to bless the outcome. I believe that we've had a fruitful congregation, and this is a wonderful start. I shared with you earlier that I would share with you the benediction and the sending forth that was given by Bishop Woody White at the 1996 General Conference in Denver, Colorado. Some of you, many of you were present for that General Conference and may remember his words, but please allow me to remind you of them. He said, "And now may the Lord torment you. May the Lord keep before you the faces of the hungry, the lonely, the rejected, and the despised. May the Lord afflict you with pain for the hurt, the wounded, the oppressed, the abused, the victims of violence. May God grace you with agony, a burning thirst for justice and righteousness. May the Lord give you the courage and strength and compassion to make ours a better world, to make our community a better community, to make our church a better church. And may you do your best to make it so. And after you have done your best, may the Lord grant you peace." Again, Barbara, thank you. Reverend Snead, Dr. Bridgeforth, Reverend Stanley, Jason Stanley, for all of your help and assistance, and for all of those of you who have participated with us for this first conversation. Thank you so much. God bless you. God keep you. And please stay in touch, stay connected so that we can keep you up to date on what we will do into the future. May God bless you. May God keep you.
Good night, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Amen. I believe I have, Jason, do I have all the folk out yet?
Yes, just you, me, and Wayne.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Do
So
you want
just,
to turn the recording off in case you're going to broadcast it?
yeah, let me do that. I'm sorry.